What are you thinking? If you're either a parent of a middle schooler or you've worked with middle school students, you've probably uttered those words. What are you thinking? Yeah, every day. And you know what the answer is, right?
I don't know.
They're not thinking anything. They're just not. So that's the nature of the brain and middle school students, and actually students in general. The brain is the source of all of our thoughts. It is also the source of our emotions. Over the last 20 years, brain research has uncovered a lot of fascinating results, and we're going to skim the surface of those results. So hopefully your interest will be piqued. Well, here it is, the brain. 3 pounds, 140 millimeters wide, 167 millimeters long. It has 2 hemispheres and 5 distinct sections that control our emotional being and our physical being. But what about our spiritual being? How is the brain included in that? So there's been a lot of research done, and in terms of how our spirituality affects the brain. In fact, when you go to the brain research, you can find that parts of the brain affect speech, parts of the brain affect certain emotions, but there's not anything in the brain that affects our spirituality. It's actually the entire brain itself. So how does the brain come into play when developing the spiritual lives of young people? And what part of the brain are they accessing, making spirituality real? Let's consider the brain when developing the spirit. We know some critical things about brain development. The brain isn't fully developed until age 25, approximately. How many of you are like not 25 yet? So I'm so sorry. Your brains just aren't fully developed yet. So you're going to have to hang with us, and we'll talk a little bit more about what that means for you. But it's good. You'll get there, right? I had a guy, Josh Hopkins, in my youth group. When he was in confirmation at age 12, I was talking about brain research and how the brain's not fully developed until age 25. And then he graduated, became a volunteer in our ministry. And on his 25th birthday, he comes up to me and says, "Steve, my brain's fully developed today." Like, dude, really? You remember that for the last 12 years? So it'll happen. The prefrontal cortex is the place where that's developed at age 25, and it's where rational thought takes place, and where you develop reasoning. So that's really you're in the midst of that, developing the prefrontal cortex and the ability to rationally think and consider things. Therefore, young people make decisions out of the amygdala while the prefrontal cortex is still developing. The amygdala is responsible for emotions and impulse decisions. If you put it all together, when a young person does something unexpected or without thinking based on their emotions, there is a neuroscientific reason for it. They are using the amygdala as God intended them to use. If God intended this to be the case, then how can we use this fact to their advantage in developing their spiritual being? Well, I know what the problem is. It's you. And it's me. We're all part of the problem. What happens if you're over 25, you've developed your prefrontal cortex. So as you begin to consider your own spiritual life, you've asked all the important questions about what it means to have faith in God. You've kind of worked through your faith. So your faith is who you are, you've thought through it, all of those things have been considered. Therefore, you are more likely to be teaching a God and a Jesus out of your own thought processes. In a sense, you have worked out your faith. At your age, you've considered all the hard questions. So it makes sense, right? You just need to take teenagers through the same set of options that you went through. Ask them the same questions. Give them the same scenarios. And then they'll develop a faith similar to the one that you have, right? Wrong! It doesn't work that way. Their brains think differently than that. Literally. You're using this part of the brain, they're using this part of the brain. You will have to constantly remind yourself that of that fact in their development. And as they mature, using more and more of their prefrontal cortex, expressing their faith progression in the way that you've learned it, then they will do exactly what all teenagers do in your youth group. They will graduate from high school and leave you. And you'll have to work with the other people in your youth group who have underdeveloped prefrontal cortexes and helping them develop a rational thought process with their faith. So it continues to go on as a cycle. So what do? How do you help those people with an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex? That's the question. One way is to recognize that their feelings are important. Listen for their feelings and affirm them when they share them with you. Never discount their feelings just because you don't understand what they're talking about or just because you haven't experienced what they're telling you about. When they're telling you that they're in the middle of a crisis, don't discount their crisis. Their crisis is real, even if it's not real for you. They have an emotional feeling connected with that crisis, and it's your job not to discount it, but to find out more about how they're feeling about that crisis. Their feelings drive their decisions, and they perceive everyone else makes decisions about them based on their feelings. Follow me on that? Because what happens when a young person comes to you and says, I did really bad on this test, or I'm getting a bad grade in my class? How do they characterize the teacher?
They gave me that grade.
Of course, yeah, they gave them that grade, but what else do they say about that?
They don't like them.
Yeah, they don't like them. I hear that all the time. That teacher doesn't like me, they gave me a bad grade. So it was really about that teacher's feeling about them. That's how they were interpreting it. Now, the teacher may not like them. I don't really know. But their interpretation is a feeling level interpretation of the situation going on. So exercise your empathy. Attempt to understand their experience. Recall your experiences as a young person growing up. Now, I'm not saying say the line, when I was your age, because it just makes you sound old when you say that. But in your head, think, well, when I was their age, how did I feel? And then begin to empathize with them and get at the feeling that they have. We had a boy named Michael who was in our youth group, and when he was in college at FSU, as a matter of fact, he broke up, or his girlfriend broke up with him, I should say. And he made a decision to sleep outside her apartment door all night. He was not using his prefrontal cortex to make that decision. There was no reasonable or rational thought that would say that was a very good idea at all. But it was an incredibly emotional decision because he was feeling loss, he was hurt, and so that's what he did. Now when he did that, a lot of his friends were really critical. Adults especially were very critical of him doing that, because then it put her in an unsafe situation, which was probably scary for her. But as a male, even though I was a lot older than him, I could go back and remember what it felt like to experience that loss as a college student, and all I could think of, well, that could have been me, easily. I totally understand why he made that decision and was feeling the way he was feeling. Now, does it make the decision right? No, it doesn't. But the feelings are the critical part here. In your lessons, when you're giving a lesson to students, are you asking them what they think about a particular thing, or are you asking them how do they feel about something? Feeling is the important piece that we need to be asking our students, and not necessarily what they think about something. Now, that doesn't mean that young people aren't intelligent and haven't thought out particular things regarding their faith and their belief systems. They have. But feelings are the entry point by which you can get to what they think. So I've given you a lot to talk about right now. So I want you to turn in your groups and talk about how do you use feelings to connect with your young people, even either in conversation or by empathizing or by structuring your lessons. So talk a little bit how you are doing that or how you might do that if you're not. All right? All right. Good conversation. Another way to engage their spiritual development is to activate the amygdala. The amygdala is on high alert in crisis or danger. So simply simulate crisis or danger by taking calculated risks. You probably do this already, but you may not have connected the risk that you're taking with spiritual development. So these may sound familiar. Whitewater rafting, rock climbing, roller coasters, surfing. Those are all examples of risk taking with safety involved, a standard of safety. According to author Michelle Icard in her book Middle School Makeover, these risks and others such as public speaking or playing in a band are risky behaviors, helping to activate the amygdala in a way that helps a young person develop. Therefore, when you invite young people to demonstrate their God-given gifts in a way that honors God, they are making spiritual connections. Even if they don't give an in-depth lesson or they tend to sing too high when they sing in the band, they're still actually making a spiritual connection and experiencing spiritual growth. Initiative games like a ropes course are great ways to build teamwork amongst a group of people with active amygdalas. It allows young people in the midst of imagined crises and complicated solutions to work together. A few years ago, we were in Blairsville with a middle school group, and I had this great idea that we would do this high adventure kind of experience. So we sent them off into the woods with this group that we worked with, and they were gone for 3 days, no showers, had to go to the bathroom in the woods. It was great. From my point of view, it was a lot of fun, and actually it was a great memory builder for them also. But it was difficult. It was hard. It was risky. They had never done that before. We were setting up tents with just 2 tarps, and it's string, and that's all we had at night. And so these are middle schoolers being daring out in the wilderness. And I'll never forget, as we were hiking one day, Robin Allen was in tears. I can't move anymore, Steve. This is too hard. And it was an opportunity for me to teach that God's with us and God can help us overcome even difficult things. So drawing those spiritual connections was really important. And for her, later on in life, she would refer back to that camp of how difficult it was and how it was hard, but then how much she enjoyed it too, in the same breath. I'll remember Stephen on the rock wall. Stephen was about 280 pounds, and he would get about 10 foot up, and then he would fall. Now he was belayed in, so he didn't fall and hurt himself, because it was safe risk-taking, right? Learned a lot of colorful language that I didn't know Stephen knew that day. But again, it was an opportunity to teach this idea of taking risks and moving forward in spiritual growth. So what are some of the things that you've done? Tying these activities to Scripture is a helpful way to allow kids to experience spiritual growth and also activating their amygdala. So if you get together in your groups and talk about what have you done with your youth groups, or what could you do as a way to activate the amygdala through risk-taking. Go. So let's hear how you've used risk-taking to stimulate the brain. Let's share some bigger ideas so everybody can hear. I heard zip lining over alligators. At Gatorland, right?
Yeah.
You can do that at Gatorland. You can do that someplace else too?
Yeah, here it's
Alligator
not.
farm is here.
Oh, you can do that here too?
Yeah.
Wow.
It just came to mind when you said high ropes course, and I thought,
Yeah.
let's
Yeah.
alligators.
Yep. What else? Were you able to tie that in with any kind of spiritual
We
growth
haven't
lesson?
done it, but it made me think we're going to.
Yeah, right?
It's gonna happen.
Yeah. Make sure those harnesses are connected. What else? What? No, nothing? Come on. You guys were talking. Were you talking about lunch and how yummy it was? Yeah, go ahead.
So our group talked about these mountain moments that you get from the risk taking. They're usually at the camps, and you get the Jesus high, and you climb the mountain, and you can see everything below you. You can see the beauty, but you can't stay on the mountain because nothing grows up there. so you have to come back down the mountain into the forest where you can't see everything, but you can grow.
Right.
And I think in terms of risk-taking and camp and Jesus and growing these relationships with Christ, it's like we have these experiences, but what do we do with them after?
Right.
So it's not keeping them in that state of mind, but I've seen this, how do I keep going now?
Right.
Yeah. And like I think the idea of that came from, I had like an immediate reaction to this. It was just like, I don't really like this idea of like making them or taking these risks to like give them these emotional experiences that aren't lasting. I just don't know why something in me was like, I don't know how I feel about it. So we talked about that these can be good and like having these risk-taking moments and allowing them to experience Jesus through these things can be really good. But it's the idea that sometimes we need to maybe work less to create these moments and work more to help them to see these moments in just everyday life and living. So they're not expecting these emotional highs when in reality, like, that's not the case every day. So.
How old are you?
20.
20? Wow.
Yeah.
You're pretty mature. Yeah. And you're right, except that that's an adult view of teenagers and how they utilize their brain. And yes, if you do the risk-taking without the connection to their spiritual growth, without talking about the mountaintop and how nothing grows up here, and you need to get down from the mountain, then yeah, you've lost the teaching moment. And oftentimes in youth ministry, we'll do these really cool things with kids, and then we won't translate it for them in terms of their spiritual development.
Yeah.
Which that's the critical piece that we miss. It's not that we shouldn't do them because they need to experience, understand what God looks like down in the valley all the time. It's that we have to translate it up here on the mountaintop before we come down the valley, and then it has more probability of lasting. Well, we've all experienced it, right? That last day of camp or a mission trip, kind of what you're talking about, really. It's you've planned this epic worship service, or you're going to be part of this epic worship service, and you know what's going to happen. I mean, people are going to get all emotional, and there's going to be some tears out there. And while some of you probably resonate with that and can't wait to get to that last day, like, this is going to be so awesome, people are going to give their life to Jesus, and it's going to be great. I hated that. I dreaded that night. Because I kind of felt like what you were saying, that I was manipulating kids to make a decision about their faith in Christ, and that just didn't feel right for me. But research says that kids learn through emotional connections. That those emotional pieces are what's embedded in their memory as being spiritually significant for them. And so it's really important that we provide those kinds of experiences for them. So the question would be, well, how do we really do that in a way that that feels good to those of us who don't like those end of the week emotional moments? We have a girl named Grace in our youth group, and she's known for crying on the last night. And so everybody gets ready for Grace to cry. Grace bawls for like hours, and that's kind of the thing that she does. And she prepares for it. Like, yeah, I'm going to cry tonight. I mean, that's what she does. So then it becomes more about her crying than it is about the spiritual experience. So how do we get kids away from that idea of cry night to experiencing the spiritual significance of that moment? So most of us can recall a pivotal moment in our lives. You know, I can still, when I think of my wife at the back of the sanctuary on the day that I got married, I remember how I felt that moment. That was like really, really incredible. When I think about when my children were born, especially my daughter, who was our firstborn, in that moment, that I can see everything. If I think about it in my head, I can see everything that was in the room and the emotions that I felt that day. So that was spiritually stamped in my brain. And likewise, all of the spiritual moments, the spiritual highs that I've had, the significant moments in my spiritual development had an emotional tag with it that's stamped in my brain. So we can't ignore those, and there are tears that come with some of those moments for me also. But there's a difference between manipulation and letting the Holy Spirit enter into the space of a spiritual moment. It has to do with intent. Is the intent to get youth to cry, or is the intent to create moments of reflection, worship, and community? Faith is an intensely personal decision that is covered in emotion. You can't avoid it. So, every year we have, in our youth group, an all-youth retreat. That's what we call it. It's at the beginning of the school year, and it's we get everybody to go. So middle schoolers, high schoolers, there's usually 80 to 100 plus on this retreat, and it's a way for us to kind of begin the year right, to do a little bit of planning for the year, but also have some spiritual moments that kind of just sets our compass the right direction. A number of weeks before the all-youth retreat several years ago, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, the best friend of one of our students, Corey, died of a genetic condition. His brother had died 6 months earlier, his twin brother had died 6 months earlier of the same condition. So these were two guys that Corey had lost within the period of 6 months, and Corey was pretty wrecked by it. It was tough. Corey was on our planning team. He was a senior that year, and I went up to him about a week before. I said, Corey, and we had talked about Mike's death and kind of how he had been processing that. And so I didn't like pull this out of the blue. It was after a lot of discussion. But I asked Corey if he'd like to share that experience on the trip. It's fit with our theme. I don't really remember what the theme was, but for some reason it fit. And I didn't know if he would be willing or not. And he said, like, flat out, no, I can't do that. There's no way. I go, well, that's fine. You don't have to do that. I just didn't know if you were ready or if that would be good for you to do. So don't worry about it. So anyhow, we go on the retreat. Corey's there. Saturday night of the weekend retreat, after dinner or before dinner, Corey comes up to me and goes, Steve, I want to talk about Mike tonight. I go, are you sure? I go, let's talk about that a little bit. And he said, well, I just think I'm ready to kind of talk about him and what he meant to me, and I think it'd be helpful. And I said, well, just know that you're not pressured into this. And he goes, no, I get it, I'm not. So, needless to say, Corey shared that night, and it wasn't dry in the place. It was, and I don't even remember the content about what he shared, but all I remember, it was just so gut level honest about his own grief and how God had walked with him and his friend Mike and Mike's brother through this whole process of this disease that they'd had for really a lifetime. And it was a moment for Corey, it was a moment for the whole youth group, and it was a moment for me. Last week, Corey was at this conference that we hosted in Orlando. He's now a volunteer in a youth ministry in Tampa. Graduated from college. He's like 23, 24 years old now. And it was in the middle of the conference. I think it was like right after or right before worship started on Friday night last week. And he came up to me. He goes, Steve, do you remember when I talked about Mike at the retreat? I'm like, yeah. And I put my hands on his shoulder. I go, don't talk anymore. I don't think I can do it. And even in that moment, even in this moment, that brings an emotional reaction for me. It's an emotional stamp in my own spiritual development. And Corey said that was a pivotal moment in my life. His loss and the ability to talk about it in front of the faith community that I was connected with made a huge difference in my life. And I kind of knew it did at the time, but with him telling me 6 years later that it still made a difference was pretty incredible. So those spiritual stamps that are stamped with emotions are really, really, really important to young people. They're important to you. So how do we continue to give that experience to young people without feeling like we're manipulating the deal? What is our intent? So spend a little bit talking about that subject with the folks in your group. And talk about things maybe that you've experienced, things that you've done well, and maybe things that maybe you should have done a little bit differently. Well, to close out, we know that teenagers are a mess. Their bodies are changing and growing. They're discovering who they want to be. The chemical reaction caused by their hormones is volatile. They aren't thinking most of the time, but they are intense feelers, wanting to take risks, looking for some emotional markers to mark their spiritual life. You can provide them with the handles by using the uniqueness of their brain to help develop their spirit. Thanks for your time.